Let's start with trade politics with China. We're hearing about proposed tariffs. We even hear the word trade war mentioned. We see what it's doing to the financial markets, affecting them in a negative way. I want to ask you about how it's going to affect things, do you think, politically, as we look at the midterm elections only 7 months away?
Well, it depends on what happens. If we do end up in a trade war, I think it could be very damaging to the Republicans. They are really planning on campaigning on the economy, and particularly the boost that it got from the big tax cut that the president signed last December. If you have a trade war and you have markets dropping sometimes by 700 points in a single day, that takes away one of the main arguments for Republicans to retain control of the House and Senate. So I would think there are a lot of nervous Republicans on Capitol Hill right now.
Do you get the sense that President Trump is the kind of guy who's going to stand his ground on this, or do you feel like maybe this is some gamesmanship between these two nations?
Well, I think that right now it's gamesmanship in the sense that the president is taking a very tough hand. He's talking about tariffs on $50 billion and now on another $100 billion in Chinese exports. But the Chinese are not blinking, and that's really the question. The Chinese, with an authoritarian society, if the Chinese President Xi decides he wants to stand tough on this, it's not like he's going to get a lot of pushback. The president is already getting pushback from nervous Republican members of Congress, from trade associations, various Midwestern groups that would be hit by export tariffs. So I think there'd be a lot more pressure on President Trump than on the Chinese president if this actually becomes a trade war.
Switching gears, President Trump said one word. He said the word no when asked to board Air Force One if he was aware about a $130,000 payment from his personal attorney, Michael Cohen, to Stormy Daniels. Was that a mistake on his part, or how do you think that will affect him going forward now that he's actually commented on this?
Well, it doesn't affect him so negatively. It could really affect his lawyer, Michael Cohen, because if the president didn't know and on his own Michael Cohen gave a $130,000 payment, in effect hush money, to Stormy Daniels just before the election, there could be an argument made that that was an illegal campaign contribution, and there are criminal penalties for that. So, I think the president's lawyers and probably Michael Cohen's lawyers would say, when you're asked questions about this, just don't say anything.
Good advice there. What are your thoughts on the latest involving embattled EPA Chief Scott Pruitt?
Well, I think the president is going to have to weigh two things. On the one hand, I think he very much admires the way Scott Pruitt has put his agenda into effect in terms of rolling back environmental regulations at EPA. On the other hand, as we've seen, this president does not have much patience for members of his team involved in filling up the swamp rather than draining the swamp. And when you have a sweetheart deal for your housing, when you're giving raises, questionable raises to some of your top people, when it turns out in a story in the New York Times today, he wanted his security staff to start sounding the alarm so they could go through red lights and drive through traffic like a presidential motorcade to take Scott Pruitt to dinner. That's not the kind of thing that the president has much patience for. So it'll be interesting to see. On the one hand, I think on policy he likes him, but on some of these ethics issues, I'm sure it's giving the president some heartburn.
It's been an interesting week indeed. What will you be talking about on Sunday?
Well, I think the really important story this week as we get ready for Sunday is the potential for a trade war, the impact it could have on the U.S. economy, the impact it could have on the global economy. We're going to have a live interview with Larry Kudlow, the president's new top economic advisor in the White House, to discuss all of that. We'll also talk with Joe Crowley. You may not have heard the name, but he is a top Democratic congressman from New York, and there's increasing talk that if the Democrats take back the House in November, that there might be some pushback against Nancy Pelosi, and Joe Crowley might just end up as the next Speaker of the House. You'll get to meet him on Sunday.
All right, looking forward to that. Chris, thank you.
Thank you, Buck.